This mini lecture continues to talk about concepts of God that attempt to be compatible with modern science. The first we'll talk about is process theology, which has been a major movement in theology. It started, as one part of a wider philosophy, process philosophy, which was founded by Alfred North Whitehead. He began his career as a mathematician and a physicist. Then he moved into philosophy of science, and finally he went to Harvard and developed his metaphysical system of process thought. And as we've read in Barber, who is a process theologian, and in others, process philosophy and theology attempts to be a whole system that takes into account modern physics. And metaphysics, as this whole system, is all about the ultimate nature of reality and the nature of ultimate reality. And Whitehead did believe in God. So, to process theology, it is panentheistic in some significant ways. We'll talk more about that as we go along. A huge factor is that reality, including God, is in process. Temporality, time, is central to process thought. God's character may be unchanging or is unchanging, and Charles Hartshorne develops this. He was the principal taker of Whitehead's thought to apply it to theology, philosophical theology. Time affects God. What happens in time affects God. Well, and this is like panentheism in general. We could say when it comes to divine sympathy, no one does it better than process theology. Whitehead himself spoke of God as the fellow traveler who understands, who suffers with us. Let's talk about some characteristics, some traits of process theology, some of which may be problematic or controversial. The first is panpsychism. You might remember pan is the Greek word for all. What is psyche? Well, it originally means life, but we take it, like in psychology, to refer to conscious life, right? And what's going on with our consciousness, with our minds, if we're a little bit maybe dualistic in wrongly separating mind and body. But anyway, panpsychism means that every integrated reality has some level of awareness or experience. Experience is a key term for Whitehead and process philosophy and theology. Now, does that mean a rock experiences? No. And it's not necessarily meaning that a tree, even though it is an organism, experiences. There has to be sufficient integration for something to experience. So just a pile of something or a collection of atoms and molecules is not in itself aware or experiencing anything. But basic integrated units of reality like electrons, protons, and the mesons that make up protons, process thought sees them as having a low level of experience. And remember, at the quantum level, there, at least if you buy into panpsychism, there are decisions to be made, right? There are probabilities to be determined. Things are indeterminate or probabilistic until there's sufficient interaction or measurement to uh, make them occupy a particular energy state in a particular way. So that electron has some experience of changing from an indeterminate state to a, a determinate state, from jumping from one energy level where it's been to another energy level, say with an electron, as we picture it, uh, kind of revolving or at least being at some distance from the nucleus that it's part of the atom with. So everything that's integrated, that's united enough into one entity, one reality, has this subjective pole, this at least low level of experience. And the basic unit of reality for process thought is a unit occasion. So we'll talk a little bit more about time in a minute, but each integrated reality has experiences that are, occasions. So you have one occasion, and then the next moment in time, this integrated reality is another unit occasion that has some continuity, right, with the past unit occasion. A big term in process thought is prehension. We use the term apprehension. Hension, means to grasp, basically in its root. So apprehension, we grasp something intellectually, as that word is generally used. But prehension is a term that Whitehead and other process thinkers use to talk about how a unit of reality, a unit occasion, takes in, prehends other realities and its own past experiences. Now, on the grandest scale, everything is interconnected. So, in a very diminished way, we take in, we prehend realities that are far, far distant from us, and they have very little influence on us. But everything is interconnected in some way. So that could be an attraction for some of process thought, maybe in some ways imitating, or not imitating necessarily, but being akin to Eastern philosophies and religions that emphasize interconnectedness more than Western monotheisms have traditionally. So if everything has this subjective pole and we're taking things into our subjectivity, into our experience, where do we get objectivity? Where do we get materiality? Where do we get exteriority? Because interiority is taking things in internally, right, that affect us. We talked about, actually, this was in another course, internal relations within God means if God has internal relations, that means God is affected by them. And I guess I did mention that in panentheism when we talked about panentheism as well. So the objective, materiality, exteriority is constituted by pastness, by past unit occasions of experience. And when they're past, they're then finished, and they influence us. They set up the possibilities for our decisions in the moment for the occasion. Now, I said I'd talk about time. So we know that when it comes to the quantum level, things happen in quantifiable packets, certain amounts of energy, and in terms of photons and particle physics. And finally, we can reduce some of these things to atomic things, all the quantum things that finally are the most basic things that can't be divided any further on the quantum level. But Whitehead advanced the idea that time is also quantum, that there is a kind of split second of time, and these quantum may be somewhat different in length for different types of reality, experiencing types of reality. But these are very short units of time, and so you have this short unit, and then there's a kind of a space where no time elapses, and then another, after the first unit occasion of experience is completed, another discontinuous in terms of time, another unit occasion begins, a new moment of time begins that's not continuous with the previous uh, extension of time. As Polkinghorne notes, this is not at all supported by physics today, by what we know about relativity and quantum events. Time does seem to be continuous, physically speaking. Now, the fourth thing we'll talk about has to do with special providence. Hopefully, you've been reading about that in Polkinghorne and Barber. But general providence would mean God provides for or orders the world in a good way through the basic natural laws of our universe. But special providence means that God influences particular events. I mean, traditionally, this happened in a supernatural way, but process thought does not believe in supernatural interventions, but what it believes is that God provides an initial aim for each unit occasion. What does that mean? Well, in an old-fashioned terminology, we could talk about God's will. For each brief unit occasion of experience, God offers, and it's at, for us, it would be at a subconscious level. God offers as the initial aim what God knows to be the best possible choice we could make, the best possible decision to actualize, to make concrete, to make determinate the indeterminate possibilities that we have at that moment in time. So every unit occasion, and again, it's not seen as anything supernatural, but part of this wider natural process where God is the source of possibility in terms, but God set up the basic laws of the universe in God's primordial nature, according to Whitehead, and then God also acts in more particular ways by giving every unit occasion God's will, God's initial aim for that occasion of experience. Well, some might see some problems to this. This isn't empirically verifiable at all, so there seems to be no scientific or other way to show that there's any truth in this. There's also the question of if God is providing initial aims to us creatures uh, who we use energy when we input things as well as when we output things, right? In fact, I mean, prehending or perception for us, taking in knowledge involves energy, right? And our brain is very energy intensive. Um, so it might seem that if God is providing this initial aim, which somehow involves some energy that maybe could be detectable, but certainly there doesn't seem to be any energy we can say, oh, this is the energy that's involved in taking in God's initial aim. All right, a fifth point. First of all, to talk about panentheism in general. And certainly, again, panentheism is, or process, I should say, is panentheistic in the sense that God takes in all experience. We've already talked about this, basically, that God takes in and is affected by, influenced by everything. So, in that sense, at least in terms of divine knowledge, God in process thought is panentheistic. Now, in general, with panentheism, it is possible to believe in the Christian doctrine of creation ex nihilo, which would typically have been accepted by traditional classical Jewish theology, classical Islamic theology, that God did not need any pre-existing materials that were independent of God. And this is different than, say, Plato, who believed in he was a monotheist in the sense that there's only one God, but he did actually believe that matter, chaotic matter, was independent of God. It was not created by God. God ordered it or tried to bring order out of it, and we try to bring some order out of the chaos of matter. And Plato also believed that individual souls are like God, but also independent of God, not created by God. But creation from nothing says that matter and souls, if we believe those are separate from our bodies, which basically Judaism and early Christianity, at least insofar as it was influenced by Judaism, did not. But then Greek philosophy influenced Christian, Jewish, Islamic thought. So there tended to be some dualism after that. But anyway, panentheism could say that there is no other independent materials that exist apart from God in terms of their origin, and that are included within God. No, they're God. Whatever God creates is from nothing, so there's nothing external to God. And panentheism is, in some sense, all about everything is internal to God, part of God, in God, to use the spatial metaphor. But process thought cannot accept the idea that things are inside God in terms of, in terms of that all power would be given by God because, or all power comes from God because they believe that this would end up denying human freedom, that each unit occasion has to have some ontological ultimate independence from God, or it would not be free. So, like Plato, each unit occasion of experience, it has some ultimate ontological, and it means being, the ontology, the nature of being. Its being, its existence has some ultimate independence from God. And we could say, or it would be proper to say, that in process thought, the ultimate metaphysical principle is creativity itself. So creativity is something that takes hold of God, or God is influenced by, right, as well as individual creatures. Now, remember, the primordial nature of Whitehead limits the possibilities, so it limits the possibilities of creativity, or otherwise it would be chaos, right? And if it weren't for God ordering things, these unit occasions of experience would be very chaotic themselves and tend to go out of existence about as soon as they came into existence. But they do have that ultimate independence of existence apart from God. So that's a distinctive trait of process theology and philosophy. So let's move on. We have talked about how process tries to have a place for special providence. Another way some theologians have attempted to do this is through what we could call the quantum determining God. And these include thinkers, theologians like Nancy Murphy, Robert Russell, George Ellis, and Thomas Tracy. You might again remember that quantum events are probabilistic, and so we know that overall, a particular electron and a particular element, particular nucleus of a particular element, say carbon, has a certain percent chance of being in this energy orbit and another chance in being this energy orbit. And in a radioactive substance, the atoms have an equal probability of decaying at a particular time, but whether this one or that one does, we don't know, right? It's probabilistic. So what these folks say is that God, at least sometimes, determines which atom or which electron is going to be where or in what energy state. And this supposedly because God is all-knowing, God knows when certain decisions about quantum events will end up influencing history. Especially we can think of some of these going on in our brain, right? Within the neurons in our brain, and maybe, or at least as they theorize, this in some cases will have an effect where something God wants to suggest, or maybe, or at least suggest, if not cause, will happen, and so God can influence through special providence the unfolding of human history, and maybe for some of these thinkers, even evolution, right, by influencing the mutations. In some ways, by determining quantum events, could influence what happens in the evolution of life. Now, for good or for bad, this would not be scientifically variable, right? Because according to these thinkers, all these energy states of electrons and other subatomic particles, the decaying rates, the half-lives of radioactive substances, all of this would remain the same, whether God is interfering, right, determining some of these events. God always makes it so the quantum probabilities hold, right? So nature is not interfered with in any observable or verifiable way. Now, there with this theory, you could ask or have two versions. You could have one where God influences all quantum events, or it seems to be the case with my impression anyway of these thinkers overall, is that just some events that might be particularly crucial, right? Maybe in leading to the evolution of our ancestors in the evolution from great apes to hominids, uh, influencing things that happen in human consciousness with great religious thinkers or founders like the Buddha and like Jesus, like Muhammad. Now, as with pretty much any idea of special providence, at least where God actually, not unlike the process deal where God just gives um, at a certain level, gives us awareness of God's will, and we have total free choice whether to pick that or any other possibility. Here, God seems to be influencing the possibilities, right, that are even available, and so there, with the question of special providence, if God heals someone or guides this person or this religious founder spiritually, well, why doesn't God heal this other good person, right, or this other faithful, believing person? Why doesn't God influence some other person to be a spiritual leader, uh, a spiritual prophet to speak to our time? Uh, so, if God is the quantum determining God, this does raise the question of theodicy. How do we justify God in the face of evils if God is able to control a whole lot of things through quantum determinations? A second issue and potential problem is the whole relationship of micro things, of quantum things, to things on our macro level of everyday experience and larger experiences of galaxies and solar systems and so on. As Barber says, this does tend to favor bottom up kind of solutions that it seems like all or most of the influence comes from the bottom up, which, are we do we want to think we're mainly influenced by our genes or by neurons that are influenced by quantum events, or do we like to think more, no, I'm making an executive decision as a whole person, a whole brain, and even I would say as a whole mind body, one thing, no hyphen even between mind and body. But this whole question of how much, if any, influence there normally is from the particularities of the micro level to the macro level, because overall the percentages are the same, right? There's a certain probability of electron being here, another one being there, and there's a certain number of atoms are going to decay. So, is any of that going to have any noticeable or significant effect on what goes on here? Now, when it comes to computers and And using quantum atoms, or atoms we create for advanced computers, quantum computers, then we get into being able to control things at the quantum level that can end up having an influence, but that's because we're able to control things in those special environments. And as I noted in our discussion, uh, in certain conditions, physicists at Yale were able to monitor, observe without causing a collapse or a determination of an energy state. We're able to monitor and see when, and there was about to be a quantum jump or a quantum leap, and we're able even to reverse that. But these are special circumstances. So, is it even possible that when it comes to larger events, would and the way nature normally unfolds, would micro tinkering actually influence things in our world in terms of our values and what's good or bad for sentient creatures, animals? All right, enough on the quantum determining God. There's other ways that special providence might be exercised for some of the people we've been reading or reading about, besides quantum determining or the process initial aim. One who's been mentioned by both our main books was Arthur Peacock, who talked about top-down causation. He's the one who talked about how God's creativity in the world is best like the leader of a jazz band, and we're improvising, emphasizing creativity. And he is a panentheist who, I think, certainly had sympathies with the whole process idea of the temporality of reality, including God. But he actually combined general providence with special providence, Peacock did, by saying that God's creation of the basic nature of the universe had not only global, or did have global effects, not only in terms of the general laws of nature, but because of God's omniscience, God's all-knowing nature, still allowing for human freedom, so God didn't know everything that we're going to decide for Peacock. But God is through God's knowledge of things, uh, general providence sometimes leads to particular events, becomes general providence because God is able to set the initial conditions of creation as such that God knows certain events are going to happen naturally through the natural laws that God has determined. Then there's Polkinghorne, who's not a panentheist, who rejects it, and he emphasizes information. He even thinks, somewhat going back to Plato, that mathematical ideas have an independent existence in an ideal realm, which is kind of out there for most philosophers and theologians these days. But he believes, in particular, that God has given some active information without using any energy. So he believes in top-down causation because God is the head honcho who has created everything. God can provide information, without inserting any additional energy into the system, right, into the world, into the biological organism that is a human being, and so on. But or other beings, as God influenced the evolutionary process, and in humans, uh, giving us some information about God's will, again without injecting any extra energy or detectable energy, new energy into the system at all. Well, What are the possible problems? Well, this certainly wouldn't be detectable within complex systems. Well, how do we know this information comes from God rather than from our experiences and our neurons and all our perception and all that? Um, and there also is that idea of, that I mentioned earlier in relation to the initial aim of process. How do we get information into us, or in ways that register with us without some energy input that causes our neurons and synapses to process it, to be able to process it, and take it in and understand it and make sense of it, and act on it and all of that. All right, so there, that kind of, I think, runs the gamut of what I wanted to cover on process theology and other concepts of God and God's action with respect to the world that attempt to be compatible with modern and contemporary science.